Good afternoon. I'm Sherry Goodman, Director of Education here at the museum, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this symposium presented in conjunction with the exhibition by Alison Knowles, a retrospective, 1960 to 2022. By Alison Knowles, which is the most extensive exhibition of the artist's work to date, has been organized by BAM-PFA guest curator Dr. Karen Moss. Karen will be introducing our presenters and the exhibition itself, and I'll now briefly introduce her. A reminder that there are longer bios for all the presenters, including Karen, on the handout. Karen is an art historian, independent curator, educator, and writer, and until just recently, professor of critical studies at the University of Southern California Roski School of Art and Design, where she was director of the master's program in curatorial practices in the public sphere. She's had, and still has, a distinguished curatorial career, including senior positions at the Orange County Museum of Art, the Santa Monica Museum of Art, and the Walker Art Center, with a number of landmark exhibitions to her credit. While right now I'd like to emphasize Karen's longstanding engagement with the work of Alison Knowles, whom she first met in 1993 when working on the exhibition In the Spirit of Fluxus at both the Walker Art Center and the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. She subsequently featured Knowles in the 1998 exhibition Performing the Everyday at the Walker, and in 2003 organized a one-person show and residency at the San Francisco Art Institute. The current show is a true labor of love and emerges from Karen's career-long commitment to Knowles. We're all deeply thankful to her. Heartfelt thanks as well for their generous support of the exhibition to the Terra Foundation for American Art, the National Endowment for the Arts, and to Dr. Rosalind M. Laudati and Dr. James Pick. And finally, I'd like to let you know that immediately following the symposium, Berkeley students will be performing some of Knowles' signature event scores in the space right outside the theater. And now, Karen Moss.
Oh, these would be my sunglasses. Okay. Thank you very much, Sherry, for that warm welcome. And I'd also like to acknowledge two other Berkeley Art Museum staff members, Sean Carson and also Dave Taylor, for helping to organize and produce today's event. And a warm welcome to the audience, all of you, and to the participants in the symposium. I will begin with a very brief introduction to the exhibition and the participants. I really hope that most of you have seen the show, but in the event that you have not, I will do a little kind of walkthrough. On the screen, I wanted to first show you the center image, which is by Alison Knowles, the artist's first book, published by the Something Else Press in 1965. This is flanked by photographs of the artist in 1962 at the left, performing at a Fluxus festival with Dick Higgins, and in the 2000s on the right in her studio. Part of the Great Bear pamphlet series, this publication of 17 event scores that Knowles wrote between 1961 and 65, many that she performed at Fluxus festivals organized by George Machunas throughout Europe in 1962 through 63. The only female co-founder and participant in Fluxus at this time, it is within this context that many people first became aware of Alison Knowles. So, the primary impetus, and indeed, for you Trekkie fans, the prime directive of this exhibition by Alison Knowles, a retrospective, and its accompanying publication, has been to document, interpret, and illustrate Knowles' extraordinary artistic production, and most importantly, her work beyond her years with Fluxus. It is daunting to find a title for a retrospective to convey the full extent of an artist's production, especially one whose career spans 60 plus years. It became clear at a certain aha moment that the title by Alison Knowles should be the name of the exhibition and its publication, both to honor the artist's historical book and because of the many different definitions of the preposition by. First is authorship. Knowles's open scores are intended to be performed by anyone, yet these poetic texts are clearly written by Knowles herself. Second is the idea of by as an agent performing an action, which references how her scores invite and instruct participants to engage in embodied, multisensory experiences. Next is the idea of by as in adjacent, as in proximity to or in the vicinity of, that references Knowles's adjacency to the Fluxus collective. And finally is a definition of by as working through something, a medium or some other thing. In her artistic production, Knowles experiments with and works through multiple forms of materials and media that become interdependent and coalesce into what Dick Higgins has called intermedia, an approach to art that emphasizes the dialectic between media. And this is from his statement on intermedia that was originally written in 1968. Throughout her career, Alison has demonstrated an uncanny ability to combine diverse materials and processes, constantly iterating additional forms and developing unprecedented areas of investigation. During the pivotal period of the 1960s, she did her early silkscreen print canvases that preceded those done by Robert Rauschenberg and Andy Warhol. She made artist books, durational performances, and large-scale installations that instantiated this intermediate extensibility and her iterative tendencies in her practice. This decade became an ongoing source for her to mine previous images and ideas, then synthesizing them into new works. As of the early 70s, Knowles's art became even more process-oriented and recursive. In several instances, she starts a series in one decade and revisits it again years or decades later. Rather than progressing from a strict formal style or mode of practice, she innovates with myriad materials and engages a plethora of subjects. The curatorial logic and exhibition installation follows this trajectory of the artist's intermedia practice that continues today. Before entering the retrospective, one sees a timeline entitled Alison Knowles Art Life Events, which was researched and written by Lucia Fabio, who worked on the exhibition with me the entire time as an essayist for the catalog. And what this does is it illustrates the aspects of her biography and highlights of her career and her artistic practice that are interwoven to provide an introduction and a context for her work. And I do want to just tell a very short story that when Alison saw that timeline, she looked at me at the opening and she said, "Karen, did I really do all of that?" And I said, "Yes, you did, Alison." And hold that thought, because I'll tell you what she said at the end of seeing the show. So what I'm going to do now is actually a very quick tour of, it's not advancing here. Is Dave there? There we go. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have turned to the timeline here. This is the beautiful timeline that begins with Alison's birth in 1933 and goes through 2022. That's a detail on the right, and I urge you to go check it out if you haven't. I'm going to go really quickly through these slides, but the show is organized first according to her early paints and screen prints, and also includes some exhibition ephemera of her very early shows. Next, we have extensive documentation of the European Fluxus festivals. Next to that is George Brecht, Alison Knowles, and Robert Watt's collaboration in 1963, a piece called Blink, in which they each chose an image that Alison then silkscreened together on the canvas that you see there. And then that silkscreen was used to silkscreen the walls and floors of a gallery and multiple objects at the Rolf Nelson Gallery in 1963 as a very strong critique of the commodification of art that was of that moment in pop art. And they randomly selected the name Scissor Brothers Warehouse from a phone book. There's also documentation of when the Fluxus artists came back from Europe to their space on Canal Street. They did performances, and George Machunas, of course, became the publisher of many books and multiples, some of which we have here in the show. And then we move into the other side of the first gallery, which has Alison's trio of 3 intermediate projects that she started in the late 60s, where she really is coming into her own with her own practice separate from Fluxus. We have the big book, which is documented here from 1967, which consists of an installation of 8 by 4 foot pages of art, text, and everyday objects that one walks through and reads through. Alison called these transvironments short for transformational environments. And the only break in the chronology in the early part of the work is to show an actual later big book, which Alison made in 2015, which is called the Boat Book, where you can actually physically walk through and understand what these giant books felt like. This was done in homage to her brother, Larry, who was a lifelong fisherman who recently passed away. So it's kind of a memorial now, too. Next is the Identical Lunch, which I think many people are aware of, one of Alison's most famous event scores, which became a 2-year durational performance and was documented in both a book and lots of different ephemera. We also have, in the final wall of this gallery, the House of Dust. And this emanates from an early computer-generated poem that initially inspired an architectural scale sculpture that Knowles initially made as a public sculpture, but then had it moved to California, to Valencia, when she taught at the California Institute of the Arts, 1970 to 72. And this became a space for both performance and pedagogy, and it was actually one of the chapters in my own dissertation, which I just wanted to mention because I'm very interested in that interconnectedness that was housed in this space. Now we move to the next gallery, and I'm going to go even a little faster here. These are thematic sections. We have homages to and collaborations with various artists, and a sample of Alison's extensive experimental printmaking. We have hanging mixed media installations, flax paperworks, and handmade instruments that are activated. We have sound works and installations. On the right, you see one of the very large-scale scrolls that Alison has done as part of her onion skin scrolls, which are actually both scrolls and then when turned horizontally become scores for various people to activate and perform. Next, we have Bean multiples, and also the Book of Bean, which is another of the large-scale books, which was made in 1981, 82. And then we have other artist books, including both handheld and larger scale 3-dimensional sculptural books. And finally, we end with a section that is about Alison's recent work, mostly since the 2000s, that includes also the most recent iteration of her House of Dust, a 3D printed structure installed in Wiesbaden, Germany, where the original Fluxus Festival first took place in 1962, and the city has been doing a year-long celebration of the 60th anniversary. This was part of it. Now we have Alison back in her studio. Since that auspicious year in 1962, when Alison was only 29 years old, she has had an astonishingly expansive and productive artistic career. Yet, as for many women of her generation, the extent of her practice has been too long under-examined. While no single exhibition can do full justice to such a prolific 89-year-old artist, the ultimate goal of By Alison Knowles, a retrospective, is to amplify her presence in art, historical, and critical discourse and to bring into sharper relief Knowles' prescient contributions to contemporary art. So, in the interest of time, once again, I'm going to briefly introduce first our presenters, and then afterwards we're going to come up for a discussion and we'll add two of our book essayists as well. So, Nicole L. Woods is an assistant professor in art history, and design at Notre Dame University, and author of Performing Chance, The Art of Alison Knowles, In and Out of Fluxus, the first monograph on the artist, which is upcoming in 2023 from University of Chicago Press. Hannah B. Higgins is university professor in the School of Art and Art History at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where she has taught since 1994. She is author of Fluxus Experience, The Grid Book, and The People's Flag, upcoming in 2023, and is a co-curator of Computational Poetics that is currently on view at the UC Irvine Beale Center for Art and Technology. Simon Leung is professor and chair of graduate studies in studio art at UC Irvine, is a scholar and artist whose work has been shown internationally since the 1980s. So thank you everyone for your patience with this introduction. You can read more about the participants in the program notes. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Nicole up to do her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Special thanks to the Berkeley Museum of Art and Pacific Film Archive for hosting the show in the midst of a global pandemic. To also my press for the incredible patience they have shown with the many delays that are all out of our control. I'm so happy to be here with you, and to thank Simon, Hannah, Karen, Lucia, and Lauren in person, because all of them have everything to do with my book from beginning to right now. In winter 1991, Alison Knowles sat down for an interview with Aviva Ramani, a former CalArts student who split her education between the feminist art program chaired by Judy Chicago and intermediate faculty members like Knowles and Alan Caprow in the then newly founded art school in the early 1970s. A wide-ranging conversation that veered from the complexities of carving out a creative life against the professional pressures and seductions of careerism to the global threats abroad at the close of the century. Their exchange is notable for a number of reasons, most productively, perhaps, as the clearest articulation of what might be regarded as Knowles' philosophy of practice. More precisely, Knowles' claims for art in this interview are remarkable for the politics they circumscribe, an attenuation to forms of social engagement and environmental consciousness, wherein chance, for example, is not only a technique but a life practice. More on that in a moment, but first a little context. Born in Scarsdale, New York in 1933, Knowles studied French literature and painting at Middlebury College in the mid-1950s before moving to Brooklyn to complete a BFA at Pratt Institute. At Pratt, she trained under Adolf Gottlieb, Franz Klein, and other blue-chip artists of the New York School, and enjoyed early success with large-scale canvases articulating bold and frenetic sweeps of paint in respectable uptown galleries. Shortly thereafter, she took courses at the Manhattan School of Printing, which not only afforded the technical skills she needed to support herself as a commercial designer and studio artist, but also proved fertile ground for developing camera work and other material studies in typography, cyanotypes, collage, and silk screening. By 1959, however, Knowles was restless, isolated, and bored with gestural abstractionism and began to treat her canvases more dynamically, preferring the textual mashup of visual print and popular culture as evidenced in proto-pop silk screens and collages that survive from the early period, ones she left without destroying. Encouraged by the presence of experimental composer John Cage in her artistic and personal orbit, Knowles began to incorporate chance and indeterminacy as a method for aesthetic composition. A roll of the die, for instance, would determine color placement on the canvas. More than just a strategy for reinvigorating her canvases, though, on a more intimate level, she regarded chance operations as a nominal emancipation from her own willful choices, even her own subjectivity. Indeed, the adoption of the dialectical terms of aleatory procedures in her studio practice, what we might characterize as temporal and durational, fixed and loose, permitted the artist to move into a more iterative and open space of making that recruited all of the senses. By the early 1960s, this experimentation led Knowles to co-founding Fluxus, a loosely itinerant group of visual artists, poets, and composers who came together out of a shared desire to erode the conceptual and material boundaries separating art and life. The name Fluxus derived from the Latin for flow and was chosen for its breadth of meaning and linguistic flexibility. The group coalesced in 1962 when several New York artists traveled to Wiesbaden, Germany, where they would perform in the newest music festivals, events broadly determined by collaborative performance scores for action, like shaving a head, destroying a piano, reading out printer receipts at various time intervals, etc. No longer content to work within the parameters of conventional artistic or musical disciplines, Knowles and her Fluxus compatriots advanced radical ways of working in the spaces between traditional media. Key Fluxus scores and performances by Knowles, which she titled Propositions, are probably her best well-known works. Minimally produced, witty, and inexpensive to stage, in their simplified grammar, the propositions summon a variety of situations to be enacted by an individual or group participation. Several of these pieces and their variations bear out this focus, including proposition number 1, Make a Salad, which calls on the artist or anyone to prepare a meal. Proposition number 3, Nevea Cream Piece for Oscar Williams, one of 3 works dedicated to her closest friend and interlocutor, Emmett Williams, which instructs performers to massage the thick, sticky brand moisturizer all over their arms and faces into a pig pile. And this is something I refer to in the book as the erotics of the score. Anti-spectacular and coded to the terrain of quotidian objects and experiences, Knowles' Fluxus pieces expanded her painterly canvases and activities into the world of daily life as a series of gestures wherein cooperation, either private or public, is paramount to the work's completion. Her engagement with multiple forms of the domestic everyday in and beyond Fluxus, for me, signals an ethical demand, a questioning of the artist's role and authority as itself a social relation, an occasion of contingency. It is perhaps unsurprising, then, that retrospectively she defined her artistic ethos as one based on a calling, a battle, a need. Like many artists of her generation, Knowles has been reluctant to define her work as an explicitly politicized way, especially as it pertained to gender and the domestic environment so much of her work incorporates. She has preferred instead to locate her practice in the context of those like-minded neo-avant-gardists who shared poetic correspondences, as Charles Baudelaire might have it, in their diversified effort to remortgage the terms of long-established art mediums and their prescribed hierarchies. However, any close study of her practice suggests a politics nonetheless, especially in resisting that modernist project, so often male and dominated, of holding on to a rigidly medium-specific working method. But nevertheless, questions remain. What kind of politics might we imagine her work, particular forms of work making? What desires, libidinal and affective, might these forms conjure? What possible viewers, performers, and readers does her work anticipate even today? To my mind, Knowles' Ove institutes a politics of interaction that might be regarded as translation in form. And by that I mean a mechanism in which to think through a kind of participatory ecology or generative aesthetic ecosystem in which past, present, and future publics are called on to perform a work in perpetuity. We might briefly look to one key work made during a pivotal moment in her career that uniquely achieves this effect. In 1967, Knowles composed what is possibly the first computer poem, The House of Dust. Part of her series of propositions, again, this time dedicated to Emmett, the poem is a technological mutation, an ever-shifting textual spatial journey that imagined futures and fantastical dwellings manifested through chance permutations and systemized language frames. The poem's realization was the result of an assignment for an informal seminar conducted by experimental composer and friend James Tenney, who introduced Knowles to the rich potential of mixing art with electronic data processing. Like her piece 2 years later, Do You Remember? The work was dedicated not only to Emmett Williams, but had its poetic content as part of its mediated practice. To compose the poem, Knowles created a perpetually self-generating structure utilizing lists of categories subjected to random mixing by the computer's internal logic. The 4 lists, which I have over the years and many libraries tried to gather as much as possible, the many permutations. The list that Knowles chose to randomize, materials, locations, lighting, and inhabitants, were fed into an IBM mainframe on punch cards using the computer interface Fortran. The result is a series of repeatable quatrains with the refrain, "a house of," its putative rhetorical anchor. Materially produced by several hundred quatrains on computer sheets, its technical apparatus unfurls poetic content into heaps of paper, spawning ever more permutations, which you see in the galleries. Textually, the computer-generated poem resists both conformity and literary intentionality, but it nevertheless reveals a utopian world in which the actual, the possible, the unimaginable can coexist. Indeed, the reduced formulation, "a house of," achieves a paradoxical lucidity that is often fascinatingly absurd, humorous, and evocative. Knowles' unfolding quatrains, as you can hopefully read here, bespeak and metaphorize the space of line, of margins, of hold computer teeth that secure the material support. It offers the reader a continual flux, a series of shelters outperforming their environmental and elemental conditions. In this way, The House of Dust is not just a poem, it is an ever-evolving generative artwork and an interpretable score. As Karen mentioned, the poem's translatability was made plain in 1968 when Knowles was awarded a Guggenheim to transform one quatrain into a larger outdoor environment, and this is the quatrain she selected. After a series of failed attempts to have the prefabricated structures placed in one of the many abandoned New York lots that then dotted the urban landscape, Knowles proposed a public works project in Chelsea housing complex in her neighborhood. Created in 2 versions, first rendered as plastic maquettes, the biomorphic structures were designed by Knowles to visually resemble a tadpole turned to stone. The structures were envisioned as participatory environments, with the aim of directly engaging tenants of the Chelsea Co-op. But many of its residents were unmoved by its status as public art and instead took the house as an affront to their personal privacy and lived space, going so far as to consider it a disturbance of the peace and setting it ablaze. In 1970, when Knowles relocated to the West Coast to take a teaching position at the newly established Cal Arts, where she was hired to run the graphics prints lab and sit on that intermediate faculty that's become so famous in retrospect, the House of Dust environments lived on in another variation for new use and new publics. What is fascinating to me about the House of Dust's mutability is it tells us that Knowles continued to conceptualize her work as an open platform to be shared and realized, a seemingly, again, perpetual occasion for contingency and reuse. In California, the House of Dust initially sat on a patch of green meadow near disused tennis courts that overlooked Interstate 5. On my way here, I passed by it, on Cal Arts' temporary Burbank landscape. You can see some of the photographs here. Inspired by a different quatrain, A House of Dust on open ground, using natural light, inhabited by friends and enemies, the Cal Arts structures were larger than the original work. The sense of extended participation, even mediated viewing capacities, was a key difference in the House of Dust's reception at Cal Arts. Lacking a proper office space at her new post, Knowles conceived of the poetic houses as active sites for meaningful exchanges with students, colleagues, and visiting scholars and artists. One of the more notable events was Computer Poem Drop, organized at the site by Knowles and her students. The postcard announcing the performance referenced still another stanza from the poem. A house of dust, way out there, lighted by candles, inhabited by fishermen and their families. For this event, a second computerized printout of the original poem by a friend at Caltech yielded over 4 feet of poetry and was subsequently dropped from a rented helicopter over the House of Dust environments, with Knowles orchestrating the timing from the ground via 5-channel transistor radio. As Karen Moss has noted, the impetus for institutional support of activities around the House of Dust was largely pedagogical, but beyond those instructional imperatives, the poem drop event in particular alluded to other aesthetic and socio-political forces. A politically pointed comparison were the ubiquity of helicopters in the context of the Vietnam War, which saw the first large-scale use of helicopters in a combat role. In fact, some of the most enduring images from the first televised war were those paratroopers whose jumps from choppers landed in distinctive thumps into American living rooms, as searingly affective memories embedded into the psychological fabric of Vietnamese veterans and even many citizens who were only heard of it on the evening news or recalled it later in movies like Apocalypse Now. Following several years of mounting discontent about the United States war in Vietnam, the spring of 1971 brought with it an onslaught of protesters to the nation's capital. In the context of anti-war activism among students in the wider Los Angeles arts community during Knowles' tenure, the House of Dust computer drop event took on a more specific critique of Southern California as a primary driver of the U.S. industrial complex. More narrowly, like many happenings at the House of Dust, the poem drop captured a pause in the routines of campus life and created a new public space in which ideas and experiences were offered to anyone wishing to contribute. Knowles' House of Dust thus foregrounds social relations as temporarily expansive environments in praxis. Here, the artist moves between forms, textual, literary, environmental, participatory, creating potentially new publics in every instance. If we return to the poem's original quatrains, we recite and give form to the idea of witnessing, or journeying both through and out of fictive environments populated by horses and birds, lovers and friends, of all men and races wearing red clothing, housed in high mountains, by the sea, in a hot climate, or a metropolis, signifies visions of brotherly love, and also to its more direct literary source. It is perhaps unsurprising that the House of Dust poem and environments allude to the Epic of Gilgamesh, a poem from ancient Mesopotamia that follows the story of the mythological hero king of Uruk, first recorded on clay tablets dating to the 3rd millennium BCE. In tablet 7, a vivid dream is recounted in the House of Dust. This comes directly from the poem. A place where kings are stripped of their power, where patriarchy is overthrown in favor of hospitality and care for others. In Knowles' poem, houses of glass, of roots, or tin propose a new experience of spectacular and spatial reflection. There is no more outside and there is no more inside. In the House of Dust's many incantations, in its multiple manifestations and publics, we become radically other. In closing, we can extend this notion of hospitality into the era's widespread desire for non-traditional forms of behavior and art, surging feminist solidarity, and a nascent environmentalism that moved innovative women artists, especially sculptors and performance artists, who worked out in nature or in public space. Let us too recall that creative play was a critical ingredient to Knowles' very conceptualization of the House of Dust environments. Intended as social opportunities in public space, whether enclosed by a Chelsea housing project or sitting atop the edges of a California campus waiting to be animated by students and artists, Knowles' contribution to intermediate art and its politics might just be in offering alternative spaces or ecologies of participation for us in perpetuity. Indeed, art is a calling based on a need. Thank you.
Oh, I just learned so much. That was amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's here. I see so many people I love and know, and people Alison has loved and known. My friend Tykie's here, Jeff Hendricks' daughter. So thank you. Okay. The word twins appears in hollow sans serif capital letters at the lower left of the 1979 silkscreen print. Its source is clearly a rubber stamp. The registration is slightly off, so it has the spontaneous feel of a stamp thumped to the ink pad and then thumped again to the paper. On close examination, it is a rubber stamp and not a silkscreen copy of one. On 2 identical stamped lines below the word twins, Alison Knowles' choppy script appears. The vertically zigzagging pencil lines of print script look like mountain peaks. The top line reads button, the bottom line reads bean. The series of symmetrical splotches above twins are pairs, twins of some sort. Each button has a bean, each bean has a button. Brown, red, reddish-brown, yellow, blue-rimmed white. To be sure, the pair of fresh, entangled green bean pods and stems and their shadows bear almost no formal resemblance to their green button. But the leaves on their entwined stems do. The approximately matching forms within the pairs of beans and buttons in twins plays with the idea of the non-identical copy that is central to Knowles' work. The number 2 on the bottom of the image in the middle of the print cues the viewer to see it this way. 2 of something presupposes that those things have a great deal in common. Within each pair, color, and general scale, these produce resemblance. And yet, the bean and button of each pair both resemble and don't resemble each other. Each button has a face, which the beans do not. And the beans are organic, whereas the buttons are shaped plastic. The buttons would have come from a button shop or a curio store either on Canal Street or in Chinatown, where the artist ambled near her studio residence on Spring Street. Many of the manufactured objects in Fluxus works are generated there, in the bins of overruns and imperfect cast-offs of an overheated capitalist manufacturer. The buttons are of a piece with each other. They form a manufactured set, which the beans do not. The beans would have come from many different places, but they too form a set, an organic set of the category beans. The buttons of twins are humanoid and kitschy, vulgar even. They function at the level of stereotype. They share that common culture. One is a Buddha, another is in a head wrap, a third wears a fez, a fourth wears a conical hat, the fifth wears a warrior's helmet. They share human features, but differ by stereotyped form and color, even though each belongs to the category button. Similarly, each bean is a different shape, color, and size, even though each belongs to the category bean. In summary, while each button and bean pair is clearly a pair at the level of superficial resemblance, each pair's elements are also unique within the greater set of buttons and beans. But neither is each pair entirely unique as a pair within twins. To the right of this first constellation of pairs, across a fine blue line that suggests perhaps the page crease of a book, the entire image repeats itself, upside down, like actual twins rotating in utero. Not surprisingly, given the rules of resemblance among pairs and sets of the image already explored, it becomes clear that the elements have been rotated, but also moved. Notice the blue and burgundy twins are non-alike from one side to the other. Like the buttons and beans on each side, the overall design and color intensity of the two sides suggests resemblance, twinship, even though the two sides of the whole piece are actually quite different. Like DNA from two common sources, self-selecting and then replicating itself uniquely in gestation, the sequence and placement of the pairs of beans and buttons on the two sides is genetically fraternal in nature, a unique doubling of shared elements, beans as genes. Relatedly, the long green living pods on both sides of twins aren't separate from each other, but are joined at the top. One stem is the source for both beans, which curve in opposite directions. Perhaps the artist was thinking of the vines as umbilical, dispensing nutrients to the beans like the blood vessels of a mother to her twins. Perhaps the vines are rather spines, as when Knowles regularly suspended her Loose Pages book on Jessica Higgins, the dancer, her daughter, beginning in the early 1980s, making her spine the spine of a book. I have neglected to mention that Twins also speaks to the artist giving birth to fraternal twin girls on August 21st, 1964. This photographic series by performance photographer Peter Moore, actually it's an image by Jessica of Peter Moore's picture of us, taken in 1964, makes the point explicitly. Even peas in the same pod are no more identical than Alison's identical lunch. No two tuna fish sandwiches are identical. They are two, like the twins in this family lunch, fraternal. Oops, there we go. The birth announcement from 1964 uses the same stamp as Alison would use a decade and a half later in Twins. It includes our weights and gender, and the Twins stamp appears twice, as it does in the later print, once with an S and once without. There is also a blink stamp from her very early silkscreen and event collaboration with George Brecht and Robert Watts, which image appeared at all scales and across all media, and it should be said, not quite identically, since it was hand-pulled and used in various ways. We twins were 14 and going through peak adolescence when Twins was made. I was songwriting lovesick ballads and hardcore songs of rage, carving out one niche in the twinship. Jessica danced and inspired my parents and her teachers to write words and music and movement for her as she shaped herself into an artist of draw writing. These are arabesque line drawings that are also short poems or single words. My copy of Twins reads, "For Dick," as it was a Christmas present to my father. It's very hard to see here, but it's, let's see, right here. Here you go. Dick was Alison's husband, then ex-husband, then life partner, then in an open arrangement, husband again. Dick co-founded and ran the Something Else Press with Alison in the early years and was involved with happenings as well. The date of Twins, 1979, is when she would have signed this and given it to him. They collaborated on raising us, just as she and he collaborated on running the Something Else Press, where she was also a designer, also an editor, and also its namer. They had other cooperative publishing ventures, unpublished editions and printed editions. As a married couple, then friends, then life partners with children again, then as husband and wife, they collaborated on virtually everything for most of the decades between 1962 and 1970, and 1975 to 1999, when Dick died suddenly of a heart attack in Toronto. At the same time, throughout this remarkable union, each also worked alone. The relationship was deep and rich and unconventional. He was, with a few exceptions, which is why I'm here today, for the most part gay. His partners came and went, living with us, then moving on, but they were fully part of the family while together with Dick, and we loved them. But here is another picture of Twins on the art wall of Alison's residential live-work loft studio. Shown here on the ever-evolving studio wall, you'll notice other visual rhymes, patterns, and colors, images of other beans and vines that echo with wire shapes, beings, and beings that clearly have nothing to do with the daughters or family life of the artist who made Twins the artwork. There's clearly something terribly wrong with placing motherhood at the center of an artwork by a significant woman artist, now finally being appreciated for her very early contributions: silkscreen print paintings, food art, computational poetics, intermediating architecture's artist books, and last but not least, her contribution to Fluxus, a movement whose multiples and flux kits are definitively non-identical publications of objects. Twins complicates with real precision this dilemma of the relationship between the personal and public life of an artist as a feature of their work. Are my sister and I in some way non-identical human publications? I actually think so. Twins is a concatenation of elements by Alison Knowles made after 1964. Each element in Twins, it turns out, represents a pivot linking Alison's work as an artist and publisher in and around Fluxus to her circle of friends and family. The point is not that the print blurs art and life. Far from it. As a flat thing on a wall, Twins is on the more conventional side of the media spectrum of her work, making published books, artist books, sculptures, performances, and musical and event scores. But its flatness is also what makes Twins a viable key of sorts. I would propose treating Twins as an active but slowly rotating diagram that introduces simultaneously personal and artistic aspects of books by, sounds by, graphics by, collaborations by, sounds by, performances by Alison Knowles, the artist, the publisher, the composer, the mother, and the life partner. As is widely known, beans have been amply present in Alison's work, whether cooking with Cage or imagining a sonic bean garden with Bill Fontana, using them as objects and subjects in her book works, The Bean Rolls in 1964, The Book of Bean in 1981, A Bean Concordance in 1983, or the Bean Turner instruments of recent decades. Beans appear printed on a page, embedded in its surface and scattered. As objects, they roll unevenly, each type situating itself differently along a variegated line defined by its oblong, round, trapezoidal, rough, smooth, or wavy exterior. They also sound differently, feel different, taste different, and are different. Alison's most special beans, single beans gifted from friends, and the humblest from grocery stores coexist in a mortar bowl under a ficus tree at the loft. In ones, twos, threes, and fours, and mores, the collection is as much a constellation of variety as a meditation on what they all have in common. This potent biological seriality is inherently biodiverse in terms that put contemporary commercial agriculture to shame. Near the bean bowl was a much smaller box with a selection of buttons in it. Contemplating these beans and buttons with Twins in mind, we can take note of a broader message. Sameness and difference are what make all of us as humans both identical and fraternal, like and unlike each other. Our culture overdetermines individual difference, even as new forms of tribal identification lead increasingly to mob violence. In the rotations among pair and set, there may be a solution for what ails us. Variety and commonality keep the world interesting and whole. Quote, the greater the variation, according to John Dewey, end quote, no, the more interesting the effect, provided order, in Alison's case, let's call it patterns of being, are maintained. Thank you. And thank you to Simon Leung for distributing the buttons and beans.
Okay. Well, pleasure to be here. I have this abiding love for Berkeley because it's the first university I ever visited when I was a new immigrant child. I want to thank Karen for inviting me, and I really want to congratulate Karen and Lucia for this really beautiful exhibition. It's an honor for me to be here and to be with my fellow speakers. I also want to congratulate Kimberly for the beautiful, beautiful book. and I say this truly. I learned everything I know about Alison Knowles from Nicole Woods. Okay. So as you know from the handout, I'm going to structure my talk in 3 sections. Number 1, what I thought I would do is to talk a little bit about artists of my generation, artists who started working publicly in the late 80s and early 90s. And I want to think about the reception of Fluxus artists, conceptual artists, process-based artists. But I want to really focus on Rikrit Tervani, who has collaborated with Alison. I think this piece is called Men and Women Commonly Dress Alike. This was in 2011. But way before that, in the year 1992, at 303 Gallery, and I saw this, in New York. Rikrit made a piece called Untitled Free, which is a work that really harkens back to this moment in the 60s and early 70s. And what he essentially did was he moved all the contents of 303 Gallery into this area in the middle and emptied out the office so that the office space became a kitchen. And he would serve Thai food there for anybody who wants to come by for free. So immediately, one thinks of the work that has been done with food, such as Make a Salad by Alison Knowles. But I began to think about this in relationship to a few other people who were also mentioned when this work was first shown, but maybe we can come to some unexpected correspondences. So you see here is the office area that's been cleared out. Of course, one thinks about food, associated with Carol Gooden, Tina Giroux, Gormetta Clark, but Suzanne Harris and Rachel Liu were also involved at the very, very beginning. And food was a co-op restaurant that was run by artists and considered to be an art project. It only lasted a few years. And then when you think about what a restaurant is, it makes me think about the identical lunch in that the replication of the same. So one can begin to think of the menu, for example, as a type of score, right? Or that to make something over and over and over again, is that a type of ready-made? So how does the ready-made get incorporated into this economy? Would the people consuming the food also be a type of ready-made? So I began to think about what is a ready-made and how does this particular iteration of a work of art with food manifests in relationship to the logic of the ready-made. So you see that on the right are a lot of the artworks that have been cleared out of the storage area. Now, when we see this puncture, I guess one can say, between the space of exhibition and the space of storage. One's mind, at least my brain, goes directly to Michael Asher. And so we have here a very important work by the beloved Michael Asher, beloved by few people I know in this room. And this is a work at the Claire Copley Gallery in 1974, when Michael Asher had a solo show. And what he did was he removed the wall that divided the exhibition area and the back, where artwork is stored, where Claire would have meetings, etc. A few years ago, I co-organized with Sebastian Pluot a symposium on Michael Asher and Christopher D'Arcangelo, which Dorit Sipis participated in. And I think the greatest coup of that particular event was we got Claire Copley to talk about the work. And, you know, there's something about the live event where you get it from Claire Copley telling you you can't get it anywhere else. And something Claire said that really struck me was how, you know, she didn't really ever sell work. So people would come and talk to her. So in a way, this is an exposure of the relation that is in the gallery. Okay, so I want to now jump over to the House of Dust a little bit, because I'm beginning to think about this idea of the ready-made, the idea of Michael Asher and Alison Knowles, but also thinking about what goes on in the House of Dust, which we learned about from Nicole. And classes were held there, events were done there, musical events, performances, experimental types of being together. And then I go to this image, which is strikingly similar. And what is it? It is a work by Michael Asher, the project for Montgomery Art Center at Pomona College, where he opened up the space of the Montgomery Art Center by making it perpetually open during February 13 to March 8, 1970. And when you read the writings of Michael Asher, you would read about how he thinks about light or the space and the idea of the 24-hour restaurant in California. But I'm beginning to draw these types of correspondences in that the space between what we normally think of as a New York Fluxus artist who migrated to California to teach at Cal Arts is not too far away from, during the exact same year in California, the sort of paragon of site specificity, Michael Asher making a work that perhaps, this is what I'm basically interested in, is drawing these types of lateral moves in art history. But I want to sort of also think about the later iterations of Alison's work and Rickrett's work. And I won't make too many comments about it, but I just want to think about the feel and how they feel quite different. This is an event, and this is a work of art in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. So I am somebody who has an interest in art of the 60s and 70s. And I think that a lot of my interest comes out of, I guess by now it's a 34-year-long friendship with the choreographer, filmmaker Yvonne Rainer. Yvonne taught me to dance Trio A, and here I am performing it at the Berkeley Theater. And later that year, somebody asked me if I want to participate in a performance piece and a performance festival, and I said, well, I don't have anything, but I know how to dance Trio A. And I told Yvonne, and she says, call it Simon Leung dances Yvonne Rainer after John Baldessari sings Soloist. So once Yvonne Rainer gives you a title, you got to do it. This is another example of me in the 60s. So I also participated in the pronouns, a reworking of the pronouns, which, as you know, is a piece Jackson Maclow originally made for Simon Forti. So this is what we did on, I think this was the very first day of the lockdown, and somehow I knew to wear a mask. I don't know why. Anyway, but mostly I want to talk about Shelter or Playground, my participation in Shelter and Playground, which is a reworking of The House of Dust. And I think here you will begin to see some correspondences to both Nicole's presentation and Hannah's presentation. About, I think, maybe a dozen artists were asked to remake The House of Dust or reinterpret it. We weren't given any rules. We were just saying, there's a House of Dust and you're in this show, do something with it. Okay, so what I did was I invited my friend Luke Stoneham, who was living in Germany. He's a British composer. And I will just read to you what he had scripted years before. One instrument, a tenor recorder, 2 players, a duet for the 2, a solo for the 1. The recorder interior, breathe in, out, music which is indeed a little bit more than breathing. The recording exterior to the room, barely audible, is a pre-recorded audio of all the lines from Edward Albee's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, in which George and Martha say yes and no, spoken by a man and a woman. On, off, yes, no, brains, nervous systems, vocal cords as automaton. And every need to be nowhere war without end. Screen doors as membranes which both separate and which potentially either amplify or mute. What are we to savor? What are we to ignore? So I took this piece called Duo by Luke, and I used it basically as a score for a work also called Duo. Every week there is a call. If the phone rings only once, don't pick up. If the phone rings more than once, it's for you. Duo by S.L., Simon Leung, is a translation of Duo by L.S., Luke Stoneham. In Duo by L.S., the recorder is played inside by 2 players with 1 recorder simultaneously a solo and a duet. The screen is closed. Outside is a recording of a couple who alternate irregularly between yes, no, on, off, female, male, hot, cold. In Duo by S.L., the shakuhachi is played outside continuously, alternating between 2 versions of the same. The screen is open. Inside is a telephone on a bed. Every week, there is a call. The telephone was once site-specific. The telephone call was once a site-specific performance in architecture. In 1935, John Cage and Henry Cowell organized a shakuhachi concert with Kitaro Tamada at the Schindler House. Tamada was later imprisoned at Manzanar during World War II. There is no no on the telephone. Once you've picked it up, you've said yes. If there's a piece of furniture that says yes, it is the bed, a double bed. Outside is a recording of Don't Worry. It is played alternately with an electronically filtered version of itself. During a lecture, the Oxford linguist, philosopher J.L. Austin made the claim that although a double negative in English implies a positive meaning, there's no language in which a double positive implies a negative. To which Sidney Morgenbesser, responding in a dismissive tone from the back of the room, yeah. I think about the everyday, membranes between art and life, between feeling and sensing, about being with. Berlin, test the West. Proposal. Imagine a city of squatters, a city in which everyone created their own chairs with their own bodies. When you are tired or when you need to wait, participate in this position. Observe the city again from this squatting position. Under the auspices of a Viennese foundation, in name only, squatting in front of every of the 131 buildings owned by the insurance corporation behind the fake foundation. In Guangzhou, a Cantonese city for a triennial that is no longer, the squatting figures picture the relation between body and nation, power between languages in written and spoken forms. Who squats under what? Under whom? With whom? In Hong Kong, a 1967 photograph of the arrest of, quote, leftists by the colonial police. It sees into the future and animates. In Gwangju, Korea, another biennial, an exploration of the intimacy between colonized bodies, especially but not exclusively between Asian bodies, and a rehearsal for 9 collective movements, of which this is one, and testing the body of the student as conveyor of K-pop dancing, of protests across nation, and as bodies at rest. Some people own, some people rent, some people squat. I rely on the misrecognition after all of these years. So it's a bit about every day, but it's maybe just nothing because you're squatting and you're not squatting. Thank you.
Yes, anywhere. Sorry, everyone, had to get the glasses. So now we've invited two of our publication essayists to join us in discussion. Lauren Fulton is a doctoral candidate at SUNY Stony Brook who wrote her MA thesis on the sound works of Alison Knowles, and her essay for the exhibition publication was entitled Sonic Possibilities and Meditations on Being, The Mysterious Wisdom of Alison Knowles. And Lucia Fabio, who is an independent curator and researcher based in LA, wrote her MA thesis on Alison Knowles' food-based performances, and her essay for the exhibition publication is called Touch, Listen, Smell, Eat, Look, Intersensory Perception in the Work of Alison Knowles. So welcome, Lauren and Lucia. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, great. So I think that what I would like to do is, in our limited time, try to strike a balance between discussion here, and then if we get to a time limit, we can take questions from the audience next door, because we do have a setup there, and we are going to have some performances. So I just want to say I don't want to feel like we are rushing this. So I'm going to just go in an order. I'm going to ask literally one question of each person, but everyone is welcome, to chime in. Nicole, I'm going to start with you. Nicole also, of course, wrote an essay for the book, and one of the things that she astutely observes and points out is the relationship between Alison and her cohort of other female artists who were in and around Fluxus and were also, in some cases, performance artists, in other cases, video artists. And I just wonder if you could speak for a moment. You did mention feminism briefly, but I wonder if you could talk just about Alison within that cohort group of female contemporaries. Not just at CalArts, actually the women who you mentioned in your essay, Yoko Ono, Caroline Schneemann, Charlotte Moorman, Shigeko Kubota, just so that people get a kind of understanding of her relationship with them, and also the difference in her practice and why maybe this is why she was deleted from some of the discourse.
Thank you for that question. It's a topic that I discuss in the history of the House of Dust. So the book, my monograph, goes from 1958 into 1975, and each chapter is an in-depth case study. In the case of chapter 5, it's a House of Dust, which contextualizes Knowles the way that I tried to do today, but it also situates her within the context of an emerging feminist art movement, in particular at CalArts. So many of you may know that CalArts is the site for the feminist art program run by Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago, whom elicited specifically female students into their classes, and there was a very particular hostility between Judy Chicago, as Alison will tell it in her interviews that I started conducting in 2005, where she felt very put out not only by kind of activist, aggressive, as she called it, type of politics that were emerging at the time, but that it didn't leave any room for her to explore her own kind of politics. And that included the politics of form, that included ideas about publics, that included this notion of community for as much as we can sort of think about it in a non-cliched way, but that she was very invested in collaboration. And she was one of the only female faculty on staff in Intermedia for at least the full time she was there. Others kind of came and went as visiting artists. And she wasn't allowed to work with them. Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro excised her from feminist art programming, would not let her be involved in Woman House. And this was of great distress to her because she felt like she was finally in a moment where she could participate with other women artists. And she says that, I'll just quickly say that she says that it's because she worked with men. This is what Judy told her. You work with men. And I remember very clearly, decades ago, she says, well, who else was I going to work with? I had to ask my dad for permission to go to V-Spot, and I was married, at the time. And so there's a particular way in which male intercessors and interlocutors and colleagues and friends were deeply important to her. Training and her own conceptualization for practice, but also her own singular way that you described, Hannah, in your time. So yeah, there's a lot of friction in that moment.
When I first interviewed Alison in 1993, one of the very first things she said to me was also that Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro discriminated against her because, and this is crazy, she was married and a mother, and as though her status, which is ironic given that Dick was gay and that they had an unconventional marriage.
And at that point out.
Right. And at that point out. I mean, just the layers of this are, really problematic. But she really did, even though she knew her practice was quite different than what was going on in the feminist art workshop, she did feel wounded that she wasn't being included. And there are lots of stories. If you took courses from Ellen Capra, then you could not be part of the workshop. I mean, this happened. Or if you took Alison's course that she co-taught with Peter Van Riper, then you couldn't be in the workshop. I mean, there was all of that. But I also just wanted, just for 1 second, to also have you address this issue of maybe why in more the New York cohort group that Alison was part of, why she was lesser known than her female counterparts. That's another whole issue.
Yeah. So for me, for Alison's work, because has this proclivity for not keeping anything and for discarding as she goes, as part of the sensibility of her practice that I find very endearing, but as a historian, deeply frustrating, because I've had to, go through all of these male intercessors, interlocutor, colleagues, partners, what have you, to find her letters, to find her photographs, to find her scores. I found notes from 1962 that she gave to Cage, that she wrote on a train for Make a Salad, and listed what everybody would do. But it wasn't until somebody in the Cage archive at Northwestern could put all that together, and they don't even know what it is. They don't even know what they have. And so that the idea that you kind of follow, or I have had to follow historically Alison through the lives and artistic practices and archives of men, to me, when I looked at her contemporaries, to answer your question directly, Charlotte Moorman and Caroline Sheeman in particular, were, I think, savvy enough to keep literally everything. And there's something to be said to that kind of historical trail, and Alison did not. And so there's a way in which they are holding on. Now, there's a lot of different reasons for that: limited space, her Soho studio, all sorts of different reasons for that, her capacity for not really, again, wanting to kind of let work go when she was done with it. But I do think that there's something to that. Simone Forti just gifted her entire archive to the Getty a few years ago. So there's women artists of her generation that Simone and I had a conversation about this explicitly, who watched male artists like Klaus Oldenburg keep everything. And they learn to keep everything, because how else are you remembered? What other trail is there to pursue? And I think that's a really important distinction between who gets remembered and who doesn't. And it's a problem of art history, honestly.
Right. And it's a huge issue of scholarship and curating as well. But I also think there's something that we have to talk about with practices that are inherently more object-oriented, less ephemeral, easier to both maintain and keep. And, Alison's aesthetic is very much a different type of aesthetic, even than, Caroline Schneemann, who really made paintings. I think the objectness, or Shigeko Kubota, who made video installations and sculptural objects, or even Charlotte Moorman, who, was known because of her collaborations with Paik initially. So I think that there's just been a lot of contributing factors. And I thought, Hannah, your piece, I feel like Twins: A Parable, is it's poetry. It's a kind of deep read, but it's also poetic. And I thought maybe you could just comment in general about Alison and her processes and the state of her archive and things that you think about in terms of her as both a daughter and an art historian.
Thank you. That's fantastic. One sort of, I'm just going to say something kind of nasty. Alison did not take her clothes off. Right. And that's a problem, right? Because when Namjoon Paik sort of selected her as a muse, she was supposed to do this strip tease. It was Serenade for Alison. And she was supposed to take her clothes off wearing a belt that was hung with radios. And she put like 30 some pairs of underwear on.
Dick's underwear.
So that she could just keep going and she'd never be exposed. And so basically she was saying no. And it is not against the other women who were using their bodies to perform, to say important things about the embodied experience of women. But I think that also kind of got in her way in some ways. About Alison's archives, I think Nicole knows this story. Maybe 10 years ago, I'm standing in her studio and I look down in the bottom of her straw garbage can, and there's a photo negative kind of stuck by one corner in the edge, and I pick it up, and it's a historic negative from like 1971. And I was like, seriously? Like, you're throwing this away? And she said, it's noise, Hannah. I've just got to get it out of here. Well, and I think that's really critical.
Yes, and she did have a healthy, let's call it healthy skepticism about the art market, for the commodification of art. Yeah. Her practices were not only ephemeral, but by choice. She actually became not someone who showed objects in galleries, but became someone who became itinerant artist who moved from space to space and place to place, performing, doing concerts, doing residencies. So I think that's another aspect of her practice which mitigates against the idea of
she was relational with artists and audiences. And I loved, Simon, in your talk, the place of the social in your talk and the kind of challenge that your work poses to the notion of the singular genius, the citing of the singular genius. I think it's unusual that women artists are game for that critique because it undermines their ability to become stars. And I think, I think you really tapped into that aspect of kind of lateral influences back and forth. And also I just want to, talk briefly about the participatory nature of Alison's sound works. The works that she did with Bill Fontana or with Joshua Selman on West German radio. I mean, there's this history of sound work that I think, very explicitly looks at the social in sound, and that's part of what the kind of meat of those collaborations is. And there too, she doesn't get to be, Steve Reich or whatever, like she's in dialogue with people she cares about as something that's making the work. And that's sort of what I was trying to get at with my talk, this kind of aspect of the familial and the professional, and kind of, it's not that they're blurred, it's that they're cycles.
Speaking of that, Lauren, in the past and for the exhibition catalog, you have written about Alison's practice, as I mentioned earlier. And I guess that I would just ask you to comment on this important recurring thread through her work and how it intersects also with her visual art practice, because Alison will still insist that she's a visual artist, right? And I mean, we have eschewed a lot of these terms, but she was, as you mentioned in your talk, Nicole, she was trained as a visual artist in printmaking and painting. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. The other day when I was working on my dissertation, I came across this John Cage quote, or revisited this John Cage quote, and he was kind of distilling what his main goal was for his students when he was teaching experimental composition at the New School in the late 50s. And he said my aim was always to get them to see or to understand the limitless possibilities for sound from anything that makes sound. And that doesn't sound all that profound now, but it got me thinking about Alison's practice. And she never formally studied with Cage, but through their many collaborations, their decades-long friendship, and learning about or gaining knowledge about the class and his theorization of sound from people she was close with, like George Brecht and Dick Higgins. And as the exhibition totally demonstrates, I think really internalized that lesson from Cage. But what I think is so fascinating is that about her practice is that she always seems to have taken it much further and thought about sound and the organization of sound in a really tangible way. And I should mention, when I've written about Alison in the past, it's usually the more recent works, 80s, largely 90s, early 2000s, so not like the Fluxus greatest hits. But in those really early works, like, say, Nivea Cream Piece, I mean, the tactility involved in that, performing that score, to something even more recent, like the sound panels, which are not represented in the exhibition but reproduced in the catalog. The process of making those linen panels, like the imprinting, the process that is cyanotype, the found objects that she incorporates through. There's one, I don't think you have an image of it, do you?
Our images have gone. I do have
okay.
one.
It's in the book. There's one that the 2D like panel. She's threaded buttons. There's a string of buttons coming out at the viewer, and it's almost like
they turned it off.
I'm so sorry.
Taunting you or daring you to engage with it in time and space. Sorry. And I think, I think she's dealing with sound on this level that's just far more tangible and like even molecular. It's, and I guess just to end with Cage, I mean, he always said there's no such thing as silence, and something is always making sound. And I think I think that is so perfect for looking at these panels, because they're actually these quote unquote silent objects, or at least this is what I've written about. They really have this potential and this like vibrating almost. I mean, they're kind of noisy objects. Mm-hmm. They just incorporate sound in a very different way,
right? And one of
the recordings or something else.
And one of the things Alison does is she asks us to notice things in a very deep way. It's deep listening, Pauline Oliveros. It's about the idea of really focusing and concentrating on something that oftentimes is deemed insignificant. And actually the title that she gave to the installation she did at SFAI when she worked with me was The Secret Life of Ordinary Things. And that's exactly what she talks about a lot, is that these things are imbued with these multisensory characteristics. So I'm going to ask a kind of a double question here, just Lucia. I want to switch sort of to the food for a moment. So you wrote your thesis on 2 of Alison's food-based scores, Make a Salad and Identical Lunch. And for your essay, you really talked not only about the gustatory works, but also about those that activate multiple senses. So I'd like to give you a moment to speak about that. And then, Simon, I want to loop back to you and talk to you about food and relational aesthetics as we finish up. Okay? So go ahead.
Well, I think going back to Alison, pointing to the everyday and bringing these things to light, there are no viewers in her work, they're all participants. So you end up experiencing the work through multiple modalities. Make a Salad, it is a performance. You watch Alison or the performers chop the salad, it's visually activated. You are listening to the sounds, but then the event space ends up being filled with the scent of vinegar. and you get hit in the face with that. And then the salad is always served to the audience, and then you end up ingesting it. The work becomes part of the body of the participant. And I think that's really important, especially going back to like the women of the 1970s showing their body. I feel like Alison's work is so sensual because it really brings the audience into the work in a very intimate way, in a way that we explore the everyday. I mean, right now, everyone in the audience, again, you're watching us, you're hearing us, but with your body, you're also feeling the temperature of the room. Maybe your mouth is parched. I know mine is. And so that becomes the entire, the entire experience. There's a time.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. And so, with the early food works, but also, I know we don't have the images, like Lauren was saying that the sound becomes tangible, like being able to touch parts of it where the body is activating the work as well.
Even in more recent performances of Make a Salad, I mean, those contact microphones on the table, the way the production's changed. This happens every time like this.
And there's and starting from the 2000s, she began to put music along with the work, so it just became more and more sensorial, just really bringing the body into the work.
And this is really interesting because I think that focus on the body is a major part, but there's also the issue of hospitality and communality. And I think that this is something that was inherent to Alison's work from the very beginning that was different, in fact, from her male counterparts, right? It was always about things that did have to do with food and other things related to domesticity, domestic structures, etc. So Simon, I'd like to comment on something that came up when Alison did her project parallel to her project at SFAI. Nicholas Borio curated an exhibition that maybe some of you here saw, which was called Touch Relational Art from the 90s till now. And I'd like you to just briefly comment on the difference between, let's say, what Alison was doing and what artists like Rick Ritt and others in and around relational practices, or even other artists that how they think about this idea of hospitality, and whether it is, I feel like it's very different. It's less visceral, it's less physical, it's less, embodied. But I'd like to hear what you think about that. And also to touch back to what Nicole said, Alison and the feminist artists were doing practices like this years and years before the relational artists, yet this was never mentioned in Borio's text as well. So I just want to hear your take on the relational. Since you are also a theorist, I want to give you that opportunity to respond.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? All right. I want to say two brief things. The first is that when you're speaking in a microphone, I always tell people you're creating space. That what you think is sound is always space. So this reminds me very much of what we're talking about. The second thing that I want to propose, just on a theoretical level before I get to the specific, is that the guest of the host is always the host of the host. In that the host relies on the hospitality, in a sense, of a guest for that condition of hospitality. So I think the relation of guest, host, conviviality, hospitality, I think one must think about these in a more expansive, perhaps circular, perhaps, holistic way. Okay, so Rick Ritt. I'll just speak about Rick Ritt because I talked about him, and I don't want to launch into an entire...
A critique of relational aesthetics?
20 years too late. All right. there is no more cosmopolitan figure than Rickert. Rickert was born in Buenos Aires. His father was a diplomat. He grew up in Thailand. He's Thai. Part of his family was actually Chinese, who changed their name so that the family can work in the Thai government. He went to school in Canada. He went to school in Chicago. He went to the Whitney program. His career was really launched in Europe. Okay. Thai food. Then, why Thai food? It seems to me that by the late 1980s, early 90s, after the moment of appropriation, after, let's say, Barbara Kruger saying, not a table, not a chair, not a piece of lint is outside of the economy, we have an understanding of the ready-made relation that I think is profoundly different from what it might have been 30 years before. And I think that it was very commonplace for us to think about identities in the 1980s as ready-mades. But not only identities, I think that by the time of Rickert's first, I actually was physically there at all of these things, in New York, like the show at Althea Theophora, the 303 show, et cetera, I think the feeling is that this was a way to address the other historical, political space in the art world, which was identity politics, right? And Chinatown is literally 5 blocks away, from all these galleries, or less, actually. And therefore, I think that there's a logic of the ready-made inherent in art history as ready-made. You know what I mean? So in other words, Michael Asher and Alison Knowles and Gordon Matta Clark, all of these things were available for artists of our generations in thinking through the 15 years before. So I'm thinking about the pictures generation, thinking about appropriation, thinking about what is an image, what is representation. So I think that one thing that is really pronounced in that moment of relational aesthetics, and many of us made the choice of throwing in a lot, with that or not. I obviously am somebody who did not, right? I think it really had to do with what we thought of as a core concern in our work. And in some ways, I think the reason Rickert makes Thai food, and, to inaugurate, the work, is because he is actually commenting on the politics and the demand upon people who occupy certain bodies to do that. Now, I would say that I'm doing a similar thing, except I think perhaps the squatting body is accessible by all bodies, and it is only an indivisible remainder of difference from the point of view of those in power.
And I'm really sorry, I'm getting a time signal here, but I just want to sort of close by saying I also think that, in a sense, so many things, be it relational aesthetics, be it body art, be it even into the realm of artist books, durational performance, not just food. Alison, I think, really has also been an artist. So I think that what you talk about is that you, in art schools, artists of multiple generations, even if she didn't get certain kinds of, types of exhibitions or imprimatur by certain types of institutions, she has been an artist her whole life. And I think that that is one of the things that we wanted to do here, is also ground her practice, but also pay homage to how important an influence she has been on generations of artists. And we thank you for being the artist on our panel for that. Yeah. So everyone, thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen.
We have to exit very quickly out the door. We are going next door directly, if you would like, to the atrium where we can take questions and we can also see a few event scores. So please follow ahead. Thank you.